Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. This next panel is titled the public safety role of social media companies and technology companies. I'm so lucky to be joined by a panel of phenomenal panelists. I'd like to take just a moment to introduce each one of them. First, we have Patricia Carts, who is the head of global safety and outreach at Twitter, where she works to define Twitter's policy and ensure user safety and security in the challenging realm of modern social media. Her work helps Twitter defend and respect the voice of Twitter users and fights online abuse such as targeted harassment, child sexual exploitation, human trafficking, and cyberbullying. She has previously worked on Google's web spam team and also Facebook's user operations team, where she managed Facebook's intellectual property and safety teams focusing on legal issues, suicide prevention, and child protection. Thank you so much for joining us, Patricia. Next, we have Antigone Davis, who is the head of global safety policy at Facebook, where she works with internal teams in Facebook and with external safety organizations and government bodies to ensure that Facebook remains a leader in online safety. Antigone serves on the International Advisory Board for We Protect, as well as the boards of the National Cybersecurity Alliance, the Family Online Safety Institute, and the National Network to End Domestic Violence. Prior to joining Facebook, Antigone spent 10 years working for the State Attorney General, where as a senior advisor, she helped establish the office's first online privacy and safety unit and led the initiative Privacy in the Digital Age. Thank you so much for being here, Antigone.
That was right here in Maryland, by the way.
That's wonderful. Next, we have Dr. Marianne Franks, who is a law professor at the University of Miami School of Law, where she teaches First Amendment law, criminal law and procedure, family law, and law and technology. Professor Franks is also the Vice President and Legislative and Policy Director of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. She has worked extensively with members of Congress and state lawmakers on online abuse policies, and her work has appeared in scholarly publications and in popular press publications such as The Atlantic, Time Magazine, and The Huffington Post. Thank you for being here. And next we have Catherine Yontef, who's the Director of the External Affairs team with the U.S. Government Affairs at Microsoft. She's responsible for engagement with Microsoft's partners and other external stakeholders, and works with Microsoft's partners and works to advance the company's position related to the intersection of law, policy, and technology. Before joining Microsoft, Catherine was the Vice President at Teneo and a Director in the Issues and Crisis Practice at Burson Marsteller. She serves on the Leadership serves on the Leadership Council of Tech NYC, on the board of 826 NYC, and as a member of the Young Entertainment, Media, and Communications Division Executive Committee at the UJA Federation of New York. We're so glad you could be with us. So at the outset, I guess I'd like to say that the panel is entitled the public safety role of social media companies and technology companies, but that kind of presumes the question, which is whether there should be a role at all. And so I'd like to start by asking that question: should there be a role for a public safety role for social media providers and technology companies? And Patricia, because you're the closest physically, we'll begin with you.
Yes, there's absolutely a role for companies to play, and actually I think the panels that we had earlier really helped illustrate the complexity of the issues that we're discussing. And I also wanted to pick up on a couple of the ideas by really the introduction of my role is I have the privilege to represent the teams that are working 24/7 to ensure that we are looking at abuse reports, but also that we're detecting abuse as it happens in the platform. And those teams are not motivated by revenue. In fact, we kill revenue because we're killing accounts every single day. And I can't really begin to tell you how upset they get when there's high-profile escalations or cases where we have failed. And this is a very challenging field because in the case of Twitter, we see 1 billion tweets every 2 days. And it took 3 years, 2 months, and 1 day to see the first billionth tweet, but now we see that amount of content flowing through the platform every 2 days. And that's a great responsibility on our shoulders, and we need to make sure that we have rules, that we have reporting mechanisms, and that we're providing transparency with our users, and also taking action when we have to step in to ensure there's a public safety. So I absolutely think that we have a role to play. Some of us have built our careers in tech precisely to ensure that these mechanisms exist in these private companies. We want to ensure that anybody that comes to at least Twitter, I'm sure it will be the same for my sister companies, feel safe, feel like it's a space where they can share content, and where if something goes wrong, they're going to have tools available to themselves so that they can protect themselves, but also bring to the attention of the companies the content. So I just really want to take that step back to capture a little bit the human history, because oftentimes when you're reading headlines about content on these platforms, it's easy to forget who are those, in my view, the untold heroes who are working very hard so that nobody else has to see that content. And I see it almost every day when something goes wrong, and something goes wrong quite frequently. When you see that amount of content flowing through a platform, I see firsthand how upset they are, but also how motivated it makes us to increase security, to also change our rules. The rules in these platforms change as you develop features. When I first joined Twitter, you couldn't share images, and so we actually weren't seeing non-consensual nudity. And now non-consensual nudity, unfortunately, has become a type of abuse that can happen in the platform, and therefore it means that we need to have specific rule around it. So as the platforms develop, we have a responsibility to ensure that we can figure out what is the abuse. And oftentimes I tend to be the party pooper at the product meetings where the engineers get very excited. We're going to allow images and direct messages, and I raise my hand and I say, child sexual exploitation. We have to figure out a way that we can detect it and we can report it. And then they think, oh yeah, of course she was going to say something like that, so we will have to build something. And that's really the responsibility that we have, especially in the policy teams, to make sure that we're one step ahead, figuring out how any single feature can be abused, even features that have been built with a safety objective in mind, and how can we provide that support to the user base.
Great, wonderful. Antigone, I don't know if you have anything else to join, but we'll just kind of move our way down.
I figured you were going to go down the row. So, I do have just a small piece to add, and it really goes to hearing Anne-Marie's story. Like Twitter, we have policies in place that don't allow certain things on our platform. We have tools for users in order for them to manage their experience. We have help centers and information and resources. I think what I'd really like to focus on in this particular question is partnerships. So if you think about our platforms, and they are by nature social, and they are by nature communities. And in communities, we sort of all have a role to play, whether that's an offline community or an online community, in ensuring the safety of that community, whether that's our neighborhood, whether that's our online platform. And one of the ways that you do that is really by working in partnership with people who have lived experiences like Anne-Marie, with partner organizations, online safety organizations. We are experts at building a platform. We are experts at connecting people. That doesn't mean that we are experts at suicide prevention. We are experts at the legislation that's needed to get at non-consensual sharing of intimate images. And so these partnerships, these relationships that we have with Marianne Franks, with Daniel Citron, with CCRI, are actually essential to us getting this right. So I think that's the one piece that I would add in addition to this. It really is just a huge sense of gratitude and to this community for that guidance and assistance in what we do.
Oh, we are going down the line. Okay.
It wasn't kidding.
Yeah. So, as the tech person on the panel, a little bit of a different perspective, although I do want to echo what Antigone is saying, that the collaborations that we've been able to have with Twitter, with Facebook, with Microsoft, and we've worked with a few other companies, has really been something incredibly exciting in the last few years, because it's been a sign, I think, that there are really good people at these companies who are really thinking very thoughtfully and carefully about some of these issues that are becoming even more troubling, I think, with every passing year. And I've been doing this long enough, to not quite as long as Danielle, but long enough to know that has not always been true, that there's not always been a receptive audience for some of these issues, and that we've seen so much transformation in the last few years. And I do think it's because of the people that have been brought into these companies that are really dedicated And we understand very much that it's a question, too, of getting critical mass for those people and institutional support for those people. And that's been really useful from our perspective. The Cyber Civil Rights Initiative is pretty young. We were founded as the End Revenge Porn Campaign in 2012, but became an organization in 2013. And our entire focus from the very beginning was this approach of 3 prongs. We want to work on legislation, we want to work on changing social norms, and we want to work on the tech side. That was our 3-pronged approach, and very much that third part of it was reaching out to these major companies and trying to figure out how we could work together on some of these issues, because as much as we want good legislation and we think that it's important, especially on certain innovative and troubling issues, we always know, and all of you who are trained in the law know, that the law is incredibly blunt and incredibly slow. And there are things that you can do as Google, as Facebook, as Microsoft, as Twitter, that can be more meaningful for a victim than any law that's ever going to get passed. And so the fact that there have been people at these companies willing to join us in that venture has been really tremendously, I think, just to respond a little bit to some of the things that Anne-Marie was bringing up, that part of what's so difficult for victims is the constant sense of blaming, the constant sense of lack of acknowledgement that what's happened to them is the fault of someone else, that somehow we want to tell victims that they're responsible for this. And when social media companies don't do anything about problems like revenge porn, that's exactly the message that gets reinforced. So the day that Google says we're actually going to do something about non-consensual pornography, or that when Facebook did, when Twitter did, when Microsoft did, standing up for victims, Microsoft's Jacqueline Boucher wrote this incredible post that really was about sending a communicative message to victims to say we're standing up for victims. And that means a lot, really a lot. It doesn't mean that it's going to be easy to try to figure out the best ways to deal with non-consensual pornography, but it does mean, I think, on just one very almost intuitive kind of level, that you're saying to victims, we're not blaming you for this and you're not invisible to us. This is no longer something that we will simply put into the background. With all that being said, I hope that what we also talk about in the panel is how what's troubling about so many of these conversations is that we start to ask questions almost as though we've entered a new phase. Should we regulate now? Do social media companies have a responsibility now? And I really do want to emphasize that part of the reason why we're in the mess that we're in is because we didn't ask that sooner. There has always been regulation. The entire internet is a regulation. It was government funded, it is government created, it was never paradise, it was never Eden, it was always broken. So when we have these conversations where we say, oh, we know there's so many terrible things going on now, some of us have known for a really long time and have known that it was baked into the structure of the internet itself. That so much of what I sometimes refer to as the cyber idealism of the 1990s was very much premised on this utopian ideal, a fairly comfortable white middle-class, mostly straight men who really thought, well, the internet's wonderful because we're all wonderful, and we're going to create an internet that's going to make us feel even more wonderful. So what's the problem? So as long as we think that that's the case and we have this background idea that we're trying to regulate now and it's so controversial and what do we do and are we censoring? There has always been censorship. There has always been regulation. Everything about the internet is just an extension of our own laws and regulations and customs and norms. So I think it's very dangerous for us to have this idea that we're suddenly interfering with it now. It's been an interference in the beginning, and it's only a question of whether or not that serves the general welfare or it doesn't. So I think that's really important to keep in mind, that we always understand that it's not fair or accurate to try to say, are you doing something that's bad for free speech, or are you taking something away from us? Because we're all suffering to some extent from that thing called the Endowment Effect, right? That they've done these studies where they show that if you ask a bunch of people, well, would you rather have $5 or a mug? Everybody chooses the $5 because who really needs another mug? But if you have people sit with the mugs on their desk before you ask them what they want, and they sit with it for like 5 minutes, and then you ask them, do you want to keep your mug or bring it up here and exchange it for $5? People keep the mug. It doesn't make any sense, but it has something to do with our sense of, when I have something, I don't want to let it go. So when we are all raised in this environment where we're accustomed to thinking of the internet as just being nature, right? Think about the extraordinary idea that when we say something gets de-indexed from Google, we call that the right to be forgotten, because Google's now memory, I suppose, right? This is a little troubling. Or when Napalm Girl, the photo gets deleted from one user's profile at Facebook, we act like it's disappeared, and people freaked out, and they were like, well, it's like you just erased history, as if other people's profiles didn't exist, and as if history books didn't exist, or newspapers, or photos. So I think it's really important that we understand that we contextualize this to remember that everything about the internet is man-made, not to put too fine a point on it, and that all those choices and decisions we've made have always been controversial and subjective, and that we should have always been asking these really difficult questions at the beginning, and if we had, we might have gotten a better internet by now.
Sounds good. So I guess, can you guys hear me? I heard there was a problem with the microphones. Can you hear me okay?
I think you should use this one.
Thank you. I don't know if that helps. Does that help? If I stand closer to it? Okay. I don't think the mic is working. Sorry. Okay. Well, I'm going to move closer to you, if that's all right. For now. So I guess the problem with being last and answering this question is that I probably am going to echo a lot of what my colleagues here have said. Obviously, Microsoft feels the same way. We have a responsibility to do something in this space, and we, as many of my colleagues have said, there are sort of table stakes, if you will, for some of the technology and social media companies. So, much like others, we're investing in technology like for use mechanisms, content moderation programs, and the like. We have our own internal policies to help to deal with some of these things. We're partnering, as my colleagues at Facebook and Twitter would attest, we partner with other companies and other organizations to get hopefully some of these issues moving forward in a way that we couldn't do ourselves. And then I guess the last piece that I'd like to address a little bit more, because I think it's probably the only piece that hasn't been touched on, is I think probably the fourth pillar from our perspective is to help educate and raise awareness on these issues. So, as I'm sure you all would know, Microsoft, sort of in the scheme of some of the other companies here, might be smaller in scale, but that doesn't mean we don't want to have a seat at the table and a role in the conversation. So, we have a series of different programs, and I don't want to jump ahead because I know these are some of the topics that we're going to discuss later on. But, in addition to ensuring safety online, we also have a responsibility to make sure people understand it, and that they're aware of the tools in their own tool chest. So again, I won't get into details on that because I know we're going to discuss it later. But I think the one last piece that I would add, and I think Microsoft would say, and hopefully my colleagues here would as well, that we all are hopefully, I think, doing the best we can, and also feel like we're being contemplative about our approach and also thoughtful in what we're doing. But it's also worth acknowledging that regardless of what we do today, it might be great for right now, but it's probably not going to be right for tomorrow, because technology is changing so quickly, and the tactics that some of the people doing these egregious things online are going to be doing are going to change. So even when we talk about our terms of use, that's an evolving document. It's great for today, but in 2 years, we may have to add things, and we acknowledge that that's the case. So, again, I'm sort of at a disadvantage. I feel like I don't want to be repetitive going last, but that's probably what I would add.
Great. Well, thank you all for that. That was, as I was listening, it sounds like for instance, I heard words like responsibility and duty and obligations, and it reminded me of AAG Blanco's keynote this morning, where he referenced the Pew study that said that 8 out of 10 Americans believe that there should be a duty, not just like a role to play, but an obligation to moderate content on their platforms. And then in the last panel, we also heard a lot of discussion about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and how, and I won't be able to say it as artfully as Daniel Citron put it, but that the Section 230 was intended to protect Good Samaritans online and Good Samaritan companies who are moderating, I think the language of the statute is offensive content. And so to pose the question slightly differently, as from, is there a role to play? Is there an obligation? I just wanted to give everyone, the panelists, an opportunity to respond to that issue that was brought up in AAG Blanco's keynote address, as well as the Section 230 discussion from the last panel. And anyone can start at this point. I'm not going to make everyone talk about this like I did the last question.
I can go first. so that we can continue this model. I mean, we're in the U.S. right now, and actually, I like that in the panel before we talked about the U.S. versus other jurisdictions. I used to be based in the EU for all of these companies, and I liked what Britain was mentioning before with regards to legislation in those countries. Having been based there, I remember the feelings that I had as an EU employee working on these issues, where I felt that headquarters just didn't get it. And I came at those discussions with a very European view, which is, we prohibit certain types of speech because of the history that we have gone through. And I didn't really understand the First Amendment approach. I didn't understand we were protecting speech. It's so interesting to me, you move to the US and you see different types of content flowing through the platform, and you find yourself defending speech that I know my colleagues in Europe would be disgusted by. But it's not a matter of whether we are personally disgusted by it or not. It's about having rules that are as fair as possible. One of our first mission statements was about letting the tweets flow. That's what we wanted. We wanted to err on the side of more speech. We felt that speech for Twitter was very important. Also because counter-speech has been flowing through the platform too. And there are some hideous hashtags like Stop Islam that actually had mostly positive content. And when I say mostly, it was 98% content. And we would have to work with partners to ensure that that positive speech was promoted through the platform. And what we were looking at is if those people who are sharing those views can potentially change their minds if they are given the right amount of information and the right stimuli. And there are some cases where we have seen those changes. So it's an obligation in some countries, and as we always talk about how we aim to respect local laws. If I was to give this speech in Germany, I'm sure that Holocaust denial would come up, and I would have to talk about how we are obliged by law to take down that kind of speech, and we do so geographically, and we also alert our users that that speech may not have come down under Twitter rules, but it has come down under that regulation. So it's important for us, I think, as we have these discussions, to bear in mind that international remit that these companies have. And also that not every country has a strong rule of law, right? So there are countries, and I won't name them, where we at times are obliged to take content down and we go fight in their Supreme Courts because we feel strongly that that speech should remain on the site. So whether, we call it obligation or duty, I know my European colleagues will tell you that we have an obligation to regulate speech in some jurisdictions. And we need to ensure that the rules that we develop are as wide as possible and also take into account that not everybody has a Western view of the world, and we're bringing together 78% of our users are international, and they all don't agree. And the last thing I would add is that's a very interesting word, offensive, because what is offensive to me may not be offensive to somebody else. And actually, when we look at the Twitter rules, we're not necessarily looking at offense, we're looking at harm. And if there's likelihood of harm caused in the offline world because of Twitter content, and we're also looking not at speech, but at context precisely because of that. What is the context of an account? What is the speech that they are sharing, but in what context? Like how many tweets of this nature have been shared? Have they been shared before or not? Has something triggered that person? Anytime you have a terrorist attack, you have an increase in hate speech flowing through our platform, and we have to ensure that we are applying our rules, but that we're also engaging in a dialogue with the user to understand what they are coming from and to also see if counter-speech may help. Of course, not every user can change their views, and there are some users whose intentions are just harmful, and we have to take those accounts down. But the issue of obligation versus duty, I think it's one that is an international question. It depends on where you are located, and there will be different views. But I know my colleagues in some countries, in the EMEA region or APAC will tell you we've had an obligation for a long time. And it's good that we're finally having these discussions in the US too. I know that my colleagues at least really appreciate when we get to speak more and more about hateful conduct in the US, because that's something that they've dealt with the authorities and law enforcement for a long time in those countries.
So just two things. I want to hit that one response on the speech side of it, and then also talk a little bit about the obligation side. So it's an interesting thing, that the concept of free speech. You know, one of the things that I remember in law school struck me at the time, having grown up, you know, indoctrinated in the First Amendment, was that you know, speech can have two effects, right? I mean, someone's speech can shut down somebody else's speech. And I think that's not something we talk about nearly enough when we talk about the First Amendment. And so, you know, on our platform, we're balancing the desire to provide people with an opportunity to share and to share what really matters to them, with the desire of everybody on that platform to do that, and for it to be a safe space where someone feels that they can share what they want to share without being shut down and silenced because someone has, you know, made a death threat or a rape threat. So there are lots of things that people think of as speech that get covered as speech, but that sometimes are the kinds of things that actually silence somebody and aren't necessarily protected by the First Amendment. And so I think that sometimes gets lost in the conversation. And I think as a paradigm for us, I don't think we rely on one set of rules, U.S. law around First Amendment, for figuring out our own community standards. We are really actually trying to balance both those principles with other principles to allow for the you know, as much sharing and connecting as possible. So that's one thing, and it's hard. It's very hard. The second thing that I would say is that putting aside obligation, in the context of, at least of Facebook's a mission-driven company. So we have the latest articulation of our mission is building communities and bringing the world closer together. And if that's what's driving the people who work at Facebook, from the marketing team to the product teams to the safety teams, then, you know, building a community and bringing people closer together requires creating rules that allow for that. Because in a wild and unfettered situation, it's hard for people to create community and to come together. And this plays out not only in our rules about content, but it actually, if you look at some of our efforts in trying to develop infrastructures around safety, things like Safety Check or the new Crisis Hub Center that we just launched, it's based in this fundamental mission-driven approach to building our platform.
One of the reasons why this conversation, I think, is so hard to have is that we really have to think about the fact that for such a long time, we've been thinking about the internet as speech, right? And that is something that seems intuitively right, that the internet is about speech, but we really do have to understand that speech, even in the very restricted American context of the First Amendment, is pretty complicated. Now, any of you who've studied the First Amendment, you know this, that there's actually a multitude of questions to ask about whether all speech is covered, which I think everybody knows the answer, that not all speech has ever been covered. Our history of defending speech in any sense that looks familiar to us, as Erwin was saying earlier today, is pretty modern. This is pretty new. And that there's all kinds of gray areas and difficulties, et cetera. And even if that weren't the case, America is an extraordinary outlier when it comes to free speech. Our conception of free speech is really, really far apart from anybody else. So to the extent that we're associating internet with speech and speech with the First Amendment, which is a peculiarly American institution, and we're exporting it all around the world, this is part of the reason why we're having so many difficulties. And one way of looking at all those assumptions is to think of them as abstractions on top of abstractions on top of abstractions, all of which tend to resolve in one specific direction. And that direction, I would suggest, is what economists would call a moral hazard. And what I mean by that is the more you suggest that there is a freedom to do something without having to suffer the consequences. And what that really does mean, right, is that when we say freedom of speech, we don't really think that it's free in any type of sense. We mean someone's going to bear the burdens of the risks and the harms that it could create. Because if we think speech is important, it's important both because of what good it can do in the world and also because of all the bad it can do. But what our specific First Amendment absolutist doctrine tends to say is whoever creates that harm is not the same person that has to deal with the fallout. That's an extraordinary thing, right? You get to speak, and if it causes someone to be terrified, if it causes them to not speak, you don't have to deal with that. They have to deal with that. So that's something we don't talk about, right? That we separate the risks and the benefits. So those people who get the most benefits out of free speech are hardly ever the people who have to suffer the burdens of speech. Now add that to the abstraction of the internet, because earlier today we heard these wonderful commentaries on Section 230. What does Section 230 do? On top of our First Amendment absolutist position, we say, and in addition to that, if you happen to be an online intermediary, you really don't have any obligations. Of course, there are exceptions to that, but broadly speaking, how it's interpreted is not even are you a regular speaker, internet companies, you are a special kind of speaker who can have all kinds of content that you facilitate with zero responsibility for what happens. Now what happens to that? On top of that, corporate domination. Sorry to be the Marxist in the room, but corporate domination in the sense that now we know Facebook and Google and many of these companies control so many aspects of our lives. The top 5 companies by market value are all tech companies now. That's the world we live in. Corporations themselves are built on a structure where, once again, you create risks, but you personally, as the CEO or the shareholders, you don't bear the burden of that. Imagine for a moment if we thought about social media companies as if they were factories. So the idea would be that, yes, you come in, you give good jobs, you bring good things to the neighborhood, but you pollute all the rivers and you make the air impossible to breathe. And let's imagine we put in regulation that says, but you don't have to take responsibility for any of the bad stuff. You just get to keep making profit from the good stuff. Well, that would be odd, right? So we've built abstraction on top of abstraction, and this is not to call it any particular company or certainly any individual at any company. It's to say this is where we've ended up with this bizarre thing called the internet. It is a series of abstractions that tends to allocate burdens and benefits very differently, and it never tends to benefit the people who have always suffered the most, right? Because it's not a coincidence from everything we've heard today. So much of the focus is who's the target? Women, Jews, African Americans, minorities, sexual minorities. We know who the usual suspects are when it comes to who's going to suffer the most, and we know who's going to benefit. And if we build a structure that rewards content, not quality, but quantity, right? Eyeballs, advertisements, etc., where are we ever going to have the incentive to say we want to make sure that's a peaceful, good, productive, wonderful place? Especially if it is an abstraction on top of an abstraction, and it has to do with corporate profits and bottom lines, and there is no incentive, there's only a wish. We wish that Facebook would be really principled. We wish that Microsoft would be really kind here. And it's wonderful when they are. But it's a little bit like hoping that after a natural disaster that somebody's going to come and give you charity. Yes, you hope you do, and we'll congratulate them when they do, but we shouldn't be living in a system where that's what we have to depend on.
Thank you. I feel like I got the unfortunate spot in this panel. That being said, I can't speak for Microsoft. I obviously personally agree with you, and I think there's a lot we can be doing, and it's an environment that we're all trying to figure out. And I know it doesn't really do much to say that we're doing the best that we can. I think hopefully you guys agree we are learning as we go, and I know that's not particularly a good response to your very articulate expression, but I think speaking for sort of a corporation, there are so many things that we need to balance as we look at our sort of objectives and strategies for being involved here. And speaking just for Microsoft, our primary objectives in the work that we do online is to make sure our customers are safe and protect the integrity of our services. So the way that we do that, obviously there are the table stakes that we talked about before, but it's sort of hard to, and again, I'm sure we'll talk about this more, it's hard to draw the line as to where our responsibility starts and ends, and the responsibility of law enforcement or whatever, or regulations, whatever the case may be, begins. And I mean, I'm stating the obvious, but that's a challenge that we're all trying to deal with. So I know I didn't really respond. Sorry.
I can add. I mean, I think that there are some layers of complexity to the conversation. So, in relation to sort of the free speech piece of this, I don't want I don't want to take what I said earlier as an overstatement at all, because I do think that actually we do find quite a lot that there are lots of governments in the world who try to use their own regulations, their own laws to shut down the people who live inside of their countries. And so, to the extent that that free speech, that paradigm for allowing that kind of speech, is part of how we weigh things, is not unimportant at all. There are countries where if someone voices simply a statement that they don't agree with the president of that particular country, they can face jail time. And those governments do come to our platforms and demand that we take that content down and treat that individual as a criminal. And so, these are the kinds of things that we are weighing. We are a global platform. These are not so. I don't want to completely discount the importance of trying to make space for people to have speech. So I think there are layers of complexity to this conversation. I also think with something like CDA 230, first of all, it doesn't protect companies from all liability. So they still face, they cannot engage in federal criminal activity. They still face liability, with CDA 230 in place. I think one of the things that it does protect, and I know this is very important to me and to the work that my team does, is a lot of the proactive work that we do. And let me give you an example. People put all kinds of crummy stuff on our platforms. That's the bottom line. And we have a reporting system set up for people to report content, and we take it down. And this is stuff, child exploitation imagery. This is the non-consensual sharing of intimate images. We want to build things into our platforms that would enable us to be able to take this content down more efficiently, not necessarily always waiting for reports. So one of the things that we've talked about quite a bit is utilizing things like machine learning and AI to get some of this content down, possibly before it ever reaches our community. And in order to do that, we have to use data sets of that kind of content. Once we have certain levels of knowledge of that content, that can create and open up the door for us for liability. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to lose a lawsuit at the end of that lawsuit if we've been a responsible actor. But it does mean that when I go to our company with a project, the risk analysis that they have to do around that project shifts, because they know we may not get caught with liability at the end of that lawsuit, but we may have to carry through on that lawsuit that from somebody halfway through, or for years before we're able to shut it down. And so I think our platforms will still continue to do a lot of this proactive work, because it's for a lot of reasons, because we think it's the right thing to do, because that type of abuse of our platforms is not anything that we wanted in the first place. It's not anything that we want to be happening, and also because it's not in our interest to have a platform littered with filth and harmful content. But we need some space to be able to do that. And so currently with what's going on with CDA 230, I think we believe that there's a real compromise to be had. If we need to do this to fix the situation of the back pages of the world, let's do it. Our company is actually firmly committed to finding a compromise. Right now, the current suggestions of changes are not, I think, it may have too big of an impact on some of our proactive work, but we 100% believe there's a place where we can find a compromise around this particular current conversation. And hopefully we'll find it during this session.
Great. I'd like to kind of shift gears now, and now that we spend a lot of time kind of discussing it, it sounds like a lot of us are on the same page as to what the role or duty should be for social media providers. And I kind of want to switch gears and now talk about what the mechanics are that actually go into moderating content online. And so often, kind of what's the way companies define what's acceptable or not are through terms of services. And so I'd like to just spend some time talking about that and just seeing how do you guys define the boundaries of what's permissible and not permissible. And I think, Patricia, you had mentioned likelihood of harm standards, and I'd like to just kind of begin a dialogue about that and see what works and what doesn't. What have you found to have worked, and where do you see the future going?
Yeah, and I also mentioned that the rules have changed over time. I've really enjoyed my time at Twitter so far, because when I first joined, we didn't even have rules around hateful conduct, because we looked at the intent of an account. And while we'll still look at intent of the account as like one of the primary elements that we take into account when we enforce the rules, what we have tried to do is, as we see types of abuse that may become more prevalent on the site, we incorporate language into the rules. Let's not forget that the rules are not just our main mechanism of enforcement. It's also extremely important as we educate users as to where that line lies, so that they know what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable and what expectation of behavior we have. That's why all of our companies have made our rules public. And so for us, when I first joined the team, we would look at, is the primary purpose of the account abusive? In that case, we can take action. If it's not fully abusive, we can look at different types of enforcement, like temporary suspensions, or let's say you have an anonymous account that is crossing the line, we can perhaps ask them to verify their phone number, their email address, so that they can't hide under that veil of anonymity anymore, and they know that we have data that if there was to be an investigation and we received the valid legal process, we could submit. But as I said, over time we have looked at what has become more prevalent, and of course abuse shifts over time, and it shifts significantly. So when we saw hate speech increase on the platform, we changed our hateful conduct rules. And actually, Britton mentioned before the work that we did with the ADL last year, as we saw those threats that journalists were facing. And what we changed at that time was the enforcement of the rules. And I really don't want to forget that, because you can have the perfect rule written, and you may have no way of enforcing it in a billion tweets every 2 days. And this has happened in the past, where we think we have the perfect rule in written form, and when we try to apply, we see that it just simply doesn't scale when we are receiving the amounts of reports that we're receiving on a day-to-day basis. So the things that we have taken into account are the types of abuse, the features of the site. The moment you allow multimedia content, you have to take into account how that might be abused too. And we've also taken into account the abusers themselves, because this is like also the magic trick, is you want to be transparent, but not too transparent that you're providing so much information that the abusers know how to gain or work around the systems. And we also have to take into account patterns of behavior. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend to my team that we make completely public the patterns of behavior that we take into account to figure out if we have a repeat offender. However, we want to have that in written form internally, so that when our agents that are enforcing the rules, when they are looking at the cases, they can see, okay, so this guy probably has 16 accounts, and we know because he's using very similar email addresses, very similar names, he's mentioning the same accounts on Twitter over and over again, he's getting blocked or muted after a very short period of time on the site, etc. So for us, what's important is the intent, is how the site has changed, and also how we have seen abuse. One of my favorite days at Twitter was when we made public the non-consensual nudity piece. And by the way, one of the things that I loved was that we did not call it revenge porn. And I didn't have to try to persuade anybody in that room that day with the legal team that we didn't call it revenge porn, because they knew that that was not the right term. The same way that you'll never hear a Twitter spokesperson, let me know if you do, say child pornography, because it's not pornography, it's child sexual exploitation. So one of my favorite days was when we had that rule, because we saw that even with our privacy rules, which we had in place, abusers were trying to share content without the consent of their victims. And we wanted to make sure that even though we were covered from the policy side, we had very clear words so that when those abusers were caught on the site, we could show the language to them and we could explain why we no longer wanted them on the site. So those are some of the elements that we take into account.
And I know I feel badly. We're going to jump over to Catherine because I know that you always. I forgot to make a mental note to make sure you got a chance to answer that question first. But I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond, so you're not always.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, we take into account a lot of the things you mentioned. It's obviously very hard to discern intent. So when we are looking at something that's been reported, we look at context. That's sort of how we review it. So when you're talking about bullying, for example, we look at that whole conversation, that type of thing. So I'm sure our policies, and again, I feel cliche saying sort of us too, but are probably similar. But I think it's worth noting, and as I'm sure you can tell as I'm talking, this is sort of one of the issues that I cover versus you guys who, I think are solely focused on this. And one of the things I was really fascinated about when I was talking to Jacqueline, who's our chief safety officer, or chief online safety officer, was, when part of what I'm curious about, and when you talk about how we evaluate content, is sort of inevitably we're not going to get it right. And there's always going to be gray areas, and there's always going to be sort of a situation where someone says, well, wait, hold on just a sec, but I think differently. And so we were talking about, I guess it was 2 years ago now, we updated our policies to include revenge porn, because you mentioned that. And so I sort of thought, okay, well, how do people learn how to evaluate that? And so we were talking about sort of the process of, looking at sort of a new policy for us like that. And our policy was met, with positive response, and everybody said it was very comprehensive. And it looks at, pairing nudity in these photos with the identity of the victim. So, that seems pretty straightforward, but when the team started to review some of this content, of course there are going to be situations where, well, what if the person is wearing lingerie? Does that count? Or, as terrible as it sounds, like if there's a license in a naked photo, what if the name or the address is blurred out? Does that meet the standard to say, well, okay, we can attribute it to the victim because technically the name is blurred out. And so in order to deal with that, and it's sort of like teaching people, much like machine learning, to know how to respond. And so the team out in Redmond convened what we called an edge case council. So as we got this up to speed, every week the Edge Case Council would meet on the cases that were, considered to be on the edge. And over time, this so-called training, if you will, enabled edge cases to no longer be edge cases. So now, when we talk about the process, I sort of feel like we all get into, notice and take down and all of that, but to actually understand sort of the process behind what happens when we introduce something new where, the reviewers, for example, may not know how to deal with it. I personally thought it was really interesting to know, like, that is how we deal with it, and it's like as manual as it could get at a tech company. So, I know we're going to talk about different technologies, and I don't think that's what you're getting at with this question. So I'll hold on the rest of it, but wanted to add that.
I actually sort of, I think, your points are very interesting because there is this whole piece of this that is managed through policies and through review of content, and we do something very similar. We're looking at edge cases all the time. First of all, to test our policies, to figure out if you're providing the people who review the content with instructions that provide them with enough instruction to sort through it quickly, to try to get rid of biases, to try to ensure that you have some consistency globally at the same time. And that's where our partners come into play. We really need sometimes partners from all over the world advising us to try to address those issues. At the same time, there are going to be mistakes, unfortunately, no matter what. And sometimes there are opportunities with technologies to try to clear out some of that. And Microsoft, I think, should get a huge round of applause for photo DNA, because I think that's actually a technology that is designed to take away some of that. So I don't know how many people are familiar with photo DNA. I'm going to go
Why
ahead
don't
and go
we
for it and tout it for you.
Tout, yeah.
So, PhotoDNA is a technology where, it's used in the context of child exploitation images, CSE, where if we have an image that we know is child sexual exploitation, we will take that image and basically it gets categorized, hashed with this, it's basically markers so that we can identify it, and it's put into a data bank. And then anytime someone tries to share that photo again on our platform, prior to it ever being shared, it hits up against that data bank and won't be shared again on the platform. That's one way in which we can take away, over time, the need for contextual looking at images. It works really well in the context of child exploitation because there are some standards that have been developed over time by federal law about what constitutes child exploitation. And I think the companies have gone broader than those standards. And so that's an area where we can use technology, I think, to deal with some of the operational challenges. We've done something similar in the context of the non-consensual sharing of intimate images where now if someone reports us those images, we will do a very similar thing using photo matching technologies to ensure that the next time someone tries to share that image, it won't be shared again, and we will deactivate the account of the individual trying to share those images. Our hope is to actually get to a place, and we're working with Danielle and Marianne Franks on this, to get to a place where people, when they're even being threatened with someone saying that they're going to share those images, that they can actually share those images with us, hash them ahead of them ever being shared on our platform in the first place, and stop that sharing. So there are the policies, making those policies operational at a global level, important, challenging, and there will be error. There are also technologies that can assist in the process.
And I'm thrilled about what's happening with some of this very interesting work in automation and the photo hashing technology. All of that is really, especially for the specific issue of non-consensual sharing of intimate imagery, really very exciting. What I find really fascinating about these conversations, though, is how much everything that you've all described sounds exactly like law. Right? You're coming up with rules, and you come up with really good rules sometimes, then you realize you can't enforce them, or people don't know about them, or it's just something that people aren't thinking about, and so you have all these challenges. And what's fascinating for me, especially when I teach my students in my law, policy, and technology class, is that no matter what Facebook or Twitter or Microsoft does, someone gets really mad about it. It doesn't matter what change you make, it doesn't matter if you do exactly the opposite of what you did before, someone will say, well, here, because of this one case I can think of, you did the wrong thing. And it always makes me think about how this is exactly why, we develop all these cliches in law school that say hard cases make bad law, right? That you shouldn't be looking at it this way. You have to think about it in terms of scale. You have to think about it in terms of it can't just be every single person gets before the tribunal and gets to make their case. It's not scalable, right? So they're basically the same questions. But here's what's even more interesting, right? We assume to some extent that the reason why private companies get to do all the things they get to do is because they're not the government. They're not law, right? They're supposed to be not law. What I think is disturbing and interesting and intriguing and fascinating for all of these questions is if we think legitimacy of law is based on some theoretical implied consent, how does it work for private companies? Have we consented to be ruled in this way? Because to some extent, really, we are all ruled now as much by code, as Larry Lessig would say, right? Code of computer code as we are by legal codes, right? To some extent, they diverge and then they merge. But if that's the case, right, so we have another cliche, which is that if you're not paying for a product, you are the product, right? So if that's true, is that something close to democracy? Is that something close to consent, or is it something different? And then thinking about something that Antigone says, and I'm just picking on it because it was such an interesting thing to say, but to say it's not in Facebook's interest to have a bunch of junk and abuse on the platform. I believe you when you say that. I don't know why it's not in Facebook's interest if that's what makes Facebook money. I'm not sure why that wouldn't be true. And if we don't want to pick on Facebook, think about 4chan, right? That is their entire purpose for existing. So if that's true, if we've been saying to ourselves, again, a key part of First Amendment absolutism is you don't want any censorship. You don't want the government to censor you because you can't trust the government, but you trust Facebook? No offense. But you trust companies, right? But the idea is that we think that the reason why we're so confident in the fact that we don't want government censorship is because we think there's something peculiarly dangerous about the government telling us what to think and taking things out of it. But realistically, who has more control over how we think and what we do? Donald Trump or Facebook? So I think it's really worth asking those questions, right? If we built our perceptions about what freedom means or what it is that we're doing with these companies or how they're shaping us, we really have to start asking some really difficult questions about what do we think is underlying any of this. If companies are molding our lives and making these kinds of choices and trying to do the best they can, and again, I would not want to say that anybody on this panel certainly is acting in bad faith, but even given all, because I'm really speaking to systems level stuff here, right? What is it based on exactly? If we're worried about government, if all the reasons why we are rightly concerned about the government taking away options or ideas or manipulating the marketplace of ideas because we think they might not have our best interests in mind, are we so sure that the alternative is better? At least theoretically, you can vote people out of office. What do you do when you're mad at Google? So these are just questions that I think are worth.
I actually think that conversation is a completely interesting conversation, and we are in a I don't know if it's a paradigm shift, but we are in a real global shift in terms of how we think about things, how we engage as communities. Our communities are different than what they looked like certainly when I was a kid. I'm almost 50, and it's definitely different now than it was when I was a kid. I think these are the kinds of questions, 100%, so it's not offensive to me at all. And these are the kinds of questions that we're actually asking internally. So, when you say sort of, is it how do we trust you that it's not in your interest? And I can only say, trust me, you can't, you don't have to. But I do think there are some things that there are incentives and things that do play into this. And so we know, for instance, that Facebook has a really wide range of ages and a really global community. So we have from 13 to, actually I had really just a very quick short story. Someone who's 112 and wanted to get on Facebook so that she could celebrate her 112th birthday. So 13 to 112 at least on the platform, right? Then we have people from all over the world, and I think we do when you say what's the incentive to not have that filth on the platform, right? If we want, and I'll give an example. So. We know that women in India, because of a variety of cultural norms and other issues, have some serious safety concerns about being on our platform. And you were talking a little bit about what images count as, I think it was actually you, about inside of the context of non-consensual intimate images. And for many women in India, it doesn't take a nude image to put them in jeopardy. It takes an image of them with their shoulders bare to put them in jeopardy in their families and in their communities. And so, but we want them to be a part of our platform. We want them to have the opportunity to build their small business on our platform. Maybe that's noble, or maybe it's because we want them to do advertising. I'm willing to, I get it, right? But we want them to have the ability to participate, just like anybody else. So we do have incentives to try to create a space where they feel safe. And I'll give you an example of how that played out in India. We have launched photo technologies in India that allow women to allow everybody, so that people can't download their profile pictures, because one of the things that we have seen is people download those profile pictures, create fake accounts, send them to people's families in India, and say, look, your daughter is on social media, which she hasn't been allowed to be on, or your wife, or whatever it may be. And so we've tried to create the ability for them to block the downloading of their profile photo. Those are the kinds of things. So I'm not saying that we don't need to be thinking about, as a society, what the obligations are on our platforms. I think we should. We should be asking those questions. My only thing is to say we are asking those questions internally too. I guess what I would say is that it's hard to to see companies as large as Facebook or Twitter or Google or Microsoft as having any sense of humility, but we've made enough mistakes to have a very firm sense of humility. It's why my team, for instance, works with over 250 safety organizations around the world, because we know we can't get it right by ourselves. So I just want to say, sort of make that point in the context of thinking about those questions.
And I don't mean to imply that I don't, because
No,
part of what CCRI does by working with these companies is that we are, as I started this conversation by saying, thrilled at the fact that there are so many clearly good faith committed people here doing this. The question I have is that how much of that is benevolence of individuals when you're up against systems level infrastructure. So if tomorrow there are no more Antigones and they're all, I don't know who to come up with, they're all, I don't know, Peter Thiels or whatever it is, whatever you want to come up with, that's what I'm a little scared of, right? So benevolence is a good thing, but you don't want that to be the way the world works, right? Because benevolence is not something you can count on. And so when we think about legal issues and how the law should interact with the internet, it's the same way we think about the law with anything. If what's the famous quote, right? If men were angels, we'd have no need for law, right? If people could be trusted to act well, we don't need law. So the question is, to what extent is law going to push powerful forces to do what they don't want to do sometimes? Because as much as I certainly do believe, especially having worked with everybody, I haven't worked with you personally, but I have worked with Microsoft, I believe in these people here. I don't believe in the corporation as such, any of them, right? Because corporations, despite what the Supreme Court might say, are not people, and they don't have not only consciences, but also they don't bear burdens in the way that people do. And their bottom line is not. I mean, Facebook may choose to have a mission, a very noble mission. They can always choose to do that, but they're not forced to. And the day that it comes that Mark Zuckerberg decides instead he just wants to be king, there's really nothing to stop him. So that's what I'm worried about the structure. This has nothing to do with the personalities or the individuals. No. It is the concern about the structure that we are all.
No, and I think that's why, like, for instance, in the context, I do think there is place and room, and there should be laws. And as I talked about the compromise with CDA 230, I do think we are committed to finding that compromise that allows for both, that brings justice for those victims, and also allows for us to do our proactive work and other safety work. And an example of that is we worked with Danielle. My guess is that you were also, in fact, I think you were on the legislation that Congresswoman Spear has around the non-consensual sharing of intimate images. And it was very interesting because that legislation is actually designed to go right at those corporate bad actors who are creating websites specifically for the purpose of sharing these kinds of images, while trying to carve out the space for companies like that are behaving responsibly. And so there is room. I 100% agree that this is the conversation that we need to be having.
If I can, Frank, sorry to jump into, it's a fascinating debate. There's one thing that it's great, but also gives me a lot of headaches at times, but just for you guys to understand the complexity of these issues, we have a Trust and Safety Council, Facebook have a Safety Advisory Board, Microsoft does too, and actually, Danielle and Marianne are within those councils. And something that I love about bringing the council together is when we bring groups that work on safety, purely safety, content takedowns, like on child exploitation, no social nudity, etc. And then on the other side of the room, you have the free speech advocates, like strong free speech advocates. And no matter what you do, one side of the room or the other won't be happy. So if we take everything down, I know EFF are going to write an article the following day, and I'm just looking for Gillian York's tweets, and I brace myself, but at the same time, it's feedback that help us try and find like a way in between. And I've always particularly liked that as a check and balance, like who are we working with and how are we going to be pushed to be in the middle? Because if we're not making everybody happy, we're making something right. And I also wanted to share the example of a country where I feel we've been put in that position precisely where we felt quite uncomfortable. If you look at Turkey, a lot of activists felt that the last bastion of free speech was Twitter. And they really didn't want Twitter to take down accounts. They didn't want Twitter to take down speech. However, there's also laws that we have to respect. Otherwise, we might end up blocked. And actually, we have been blocked in the country twice in the last 4 years. And every time we're blocked, we want to be up again precisely so that the majority of people in Turkey who want to use Twitter are able to use it as a conduit for, sharing speech that they may not be able to share through traditional means. And in one of the discussions that we had in Turkey, we reached a decision where there are times when we receive court orders, we have to block content, and we do it temporarily while we're fighting in the courts to reinstate that content. And the activists get really mad and they say, but you are the last thing we have. If we don't speak on Twitter, we can't speak elsewhere. And if I'm not anonymous on Twitter, I'm unsafe. And that is a great burden and a responsibility that a corporation may not be able to carry. So at that time, I just thought it was really fascinating, and it was like, we want to, of course, help the activists, but at the same time, we also need to ensure that we're up and running. And frankly, in one of the meetings with the government, we thought we were going to be arrested, because at one point, given point, like, there was a threat that anybody representing Twitter at that meeting was therefore not in compliance with local law, and we were going to be arrested. And my boss just kicked me under the table, and I thought, okay, this is it. We're going to jail now in Turkey, and that will be the rest of our lives. So I think it's a debate worth having, and a healthy one to have. But I also think that at least what I would say is, in terms of what checks exist, these companies, when they have abuse in the platform, they don't thrive. Look at Twitter. The longer it takes for us to have rules that we can enforce, the more users that we lose, and that's a painful reality. But also the great work that our partners do in the council and the those conversations that we have, where I have to look at both sides of the room and see if we're right in the middle, because if I'm making one side of the room happy, then that means that I'm either censoring too much content or I'm not protecting victims.
I had one thing that I think hasn't been raised, and I can't obviously speak for Twitter and Facebook, but I think it's worth noting as well that, we as a company, and this has been mentioned, obviously have to act in accordance with local laws all around the world. We also, want to maintain our integrity and values that we all hold dear. And, speaking for Microsoft, which I think as a company has made some very sort of high integrity, maybe, unassumed positions lately, like I was a couple days ago, we decided that a solution around DACA should come before corporate tax reform. Like that's pretty going out on a limb, I think. But the reason I raise this is that, and I'm sure it's true with you guys, we not only have safety councils, but with Microsoft, for example, when we decided to add terrorism as part of our code of conduct, that was a decision that our CEO made. Like this isn't a small team of millennials coming up with the future of our companies, but we actually, like, this doesn't sound so cliche, like sort of from the bottom of our hearts feel like we have to deal with this, and it's from the top. It's not just those sort of last minute thoughts. So I did want to at least say that, to the extent that I'm sure you guys.
And by the way, some of our CEOs are millennials.
True point. But
so one of the things that AAG Blanco mentioned this morning is that while government and law enforcement has a role to play in this area, there's a common saying out there that we can't prosecute ourselves out of societal issues, and that includes online abuse and harassment. And so for that reason, we often encourage our leaders in the private sector and leaders within our communities to do what they can to prevent these issues and curb these issues before they rise to a level that requires law enforcement intervention. So I guess I wanted to pose like a broad question. Are we as a community doing enough on these issues? Are providers doing enough on these issues? And what else can be done? And Marianne, or Professor Franks, I'd like to, I'll start with you because we haven't given you an opportunity to speak first. And so if you have any thoughts.
You're a very fair moderator. I think this is great. So if the question is, are they doing, again, it's one of those questions that's so hard to answer. What's the baseline? Is there enough? I mean, I do think that one thing that doesn't get emphasized enough in some of these conversations is, and again, this is going to sound more negative than probably I want it to sound, but to what extent, when we talk about the good things that private companies can do and providers can do, I think what gets erased sometimes is to what extent have the providers made the problem itself? So there's a kind of a trick to all of this, right? To say, look, if Facebook, and I am picking on Facebook, but if Facebook launches a product, right, like Facebook Live, and all kinds of disastrous things happen, right, murders and rapes and what have you, and Top of the Top says, oh, well, we didn't really think this was going to happen, but we'll get on it, right? And then Zuckerberg has to backtrack and say, I haven't done enough on this. We're going to add a bunch of moderators. We're going to do something else about this. The question really was never posed to say, but you created this problem, so don't expect congratulations that you finally have moved somewhere where you might do more about this problem. There's no acknowledgement that to some extent you created this problem. Now, I don't mean they created live streaming. That would be an extreme statement, but just to say that there's a little bit of a sleight of hand here to say we're doing really great things when we're not thinking about, well, what role did we play to begin with in making it possible for people to weaponize abuse the way that they have, which is what a lot of this earlier conversations today was, that there's a lot of things that are possible now that wouldn't be possible were it not for the fact that certain platforms are designed the way that they are. And what I've always found odd is that to the extent that we talk about tech positivism, right, when Facebook Live is in conversations, this is, well, what about the role that live streaming would play or that Twitter would play in the Arab Spring, or what about, Philando Castile and all these great things? But that very logic shows that if you think you should take responsibility for the great things that you have brought about, then surely the other side of that is you have to take responsibility for all the gang rapes and the murders, right? You can't really have one without the other. And I worry sometimes that is how it's being presented, is, oh, we came up with a solution. And that's even before we start becoming critical about the solution. Because what really I fear, there's one direction of this, which is the algorithmic automation side of this, which I fear a little bit less in some ways, although just to drop a little asterisk to say, look, algorithms and machine learning, it's humans all the way down, right? At some point, there's a human in the machine who comes up with whatever it is that we're going to input, right? And to the extent that we can try to weed out errors, the longer we do this, that's going to maybe be good. To the extent that we're building in our own biases, it's just going to get worse. So there's both incredibly wonderful potential for algorithms, and it's also terrifying what's going to happen with algorithms. But that aside, so much of it is hire more moderators and get users to flag things more quickly. And what you notice about both of those is that's not actually Facebook doing very much, right? To the extent that you're empowering users, because I'm afraid that is the rhetoric that does get promoted, you're empowering users, you mean you want the users to basically clean up the mess that's been made, right? So how do you get Facebook Live murder videos down? You get them down because someone needs to flag it sooner. And the 5,000 people or whoever it is that they're adding, the digital janitors, as Adrienne Chen would call them, they don't get paid very much, and they're watching 8 hours a day of child pornography and decapitations and brutal gang rapes, and we're not even sure what kind of effect that's having on any of them, really, if there's enough money in the world that you could pay them to be doing that job. So I'm concerned about the material conditions of labor, honestly, that we're producing with all of this, because all of this waste and pollution, or whatever you want to call it, because I do believe that, largely speaking, all these reputable companies, I think the bad stuff, the abuse, that's mostly what you could call pollution, right? It's a byproduct. It's not what Facebook's trying to put out in the world or what Twitter's trying to put out in the world, but it's being produced along with everything else. Who's cleaning it up? And are there any sustainable long-term solutions for who's going to clean it up, or are we really just kind of spiraling out of control here, so that the people who have the least ability to be able to defend themselves are the ones who are tasked with their own rescue? And again, this is systems level stuff. This is not about any one company or individuals within the company, but I'm not sure how this system is ever going to benefit the average user, to say nothing of the average female user or the average African American user. I'm not sure how it's going to work out for them.
So I have, just to answer the question that you raised, and then to talk a little bit about one component of some of the work we do. In terms of could we be doing more, I do think an area where sort of all systems of society, including Facebook, really could be doing better is on kind of dealing with the concept of digital citizenship, media literacy. How do we create critical thinkers of what you're seeing, critically thinking actors of what you're sharing? I think there's a lot of work to be done there, because these technologies exist, and we need to give people those skills. A story I always talk about, I think you probably heard it when we were at NADV, but when I was in school, I think in 7th grade, we had an elective that we could select, and it's stuck with me my whole life, more than many of the other classes that I've ever taken, was a consumer, I can't remember what it was, I can't remember, a consumer class, like basically on being a consumer. And so like we got a subscription to Consumer Reports. I learned about like the various techniques that are used in advertising to sort of trick or persuade you. I learned how to keep a bank account. I learned what went into buying a car and borrowing money. And those skills were things that had, like, I don't know, how would you otherwise learn them? You know, sometimes you learn them from your parents, sometimes you learn them over here. You kind of pick up threads, and you know, I think there's a vast empty space there that we need to start filling, for not only just for kids and young people, but actually for adults who are utilizing these technologies. So that's one thing that where I do think we really could be doing better. In terms of as these technologies are developing, we do. I think I can speak for all of the major players, at least the ones at the table here. We do try to think about some of the challenges that are going to come from a particular product when we launch it, or feature, and to live. I think we did not get obviously everything right there. I think there have been some really great things that have happened that were already in development as we were building and launching live, that we knew would go into live, but that have happened. And I'll give you an example. One of the really unfortunate realities of our world is that the suicide rate globally is on a massive incline. To the extent that I don't want to get the numbers wrong, but to the extent that we are seeing large increases in the United States, actually very interestingly, among middle-aged white men, but globally we're seeing a massive increase in suicide around the world. So as you might expect, we actually see on our platform suicides, that people reaching out, people expressing suicidal ideation, both in post and in live. And one of the tools that we have built inside of the platform is for when someone sees, and this does go to reporting, but it goes beyond reporting. So when someone sees content like that on the platform, they can report it to us. When they report that content to us of someone indicating that they may be about to harm themselves, the person who's reported that to us will immediately get the opportunity to reach out to that individual. They will get the opportunity to reach out to a helpline if they're not sure how to reach out to the individual or it's impacted them in some way. And there are also some tips and resources that have been built into it that they can access right there. That was done with partners, with suicide prevention partners. Additionally, when that content is reviewed by experts who have been trained by these same suicide prevention partners, the next time the person who posted that content goes into the platform, they receive a message that says, someone has indicated that you may be in distress. Would you like to reach out to somebody? Would you like to reach out to this helpline? And here are some tips for you. We did this because we've had a long history for over 10 years of working with suicide prevention experts, and one of the things that they said to us very early on is that one of basically the single best way to prevent someone from acting on a suicidal ideation is for someone that they know or that loves them or is connected to them in some way to reach out. Well, we're a platform where people have connections, so we knew we had a kind of a unique role to play here. In the context of Live, when Live was launching, we were in the background building already the ability to have these same resources inside of Live. So now inside of Live, if this content is happening and someone reports it to us, the person, while they're broadcasting that they may be considering harming themselves, will receive these same resources. This goes to AI, and there are definitely complications and considerations that need to be taken into AI. It's challenging, but one of the things that we've done is, based on the comments underneath posts of this kind, we can tell that there may be somebody in distress, and utilizing those comments, when someone then goes to report, we will up the option to report for suicide or self-harm to ensure fast reporting. In addition, we are able to use those comments, and we're just testing this in the United States right now, to actually, even without a report, to offer those resources to somebody. So there are efforts to not only rely on the reporting mechanism, but to really try to figure out how we are thoughtful when we launch technologies like this to ensure that we are taking into consideration these types of situations.
And just really quickly, we've had such great conversations that time has just flown by. So we're butting up against the break. But I did want to give you an opportunity with Patricia and Catherine to respond. I just want to highlight that we're essentially out of time, and so if you could just limit yourself to a minute each, and then if you'd like to respond to that.
Sure. Yes, I wanted to echo Antigone's words, and I also wanted to maybe add to this conversation a provocative thought, which is also, anytime you develop technology, there's going to be misuse. We certainly have to think about that potential misuse, hence my comment about being hated by our engineering team, which is true. But not that I want to sound cynical, but there are going to be situations that won't be caught. That is the reality of it. There's going to be situations that all of the preventative systems that you build in the world are going to fail, that we're not going to get in time. And I also wonder, what is the solution to that? Do you want to proactively monitor every single piece of content that flows through these platforms? Going back to the idea of the corporations, those private entities, I personally wouldn't want Facebook or Twitter to be going through anything that I produce if I'm a healthy user, in quotation marks, to prevent abuse. There will be some instances, like, we talked about child exploitation. I can't expect a predator to report another predator, therefore I can't just rely on community reporting. I have to build proactive mechanisms. But the only solution to catching absolutely everything is monitoring everything. I think it's practically impossible. You can't do that with the amount of content that we see in these platforms. But also we have that question on, would it be proportionate? And that's the part when I lean on Electronic Frontier Foundation, and that's like that. The time that I look at that side of the room to find those proportionate measures, we have to anticipate what is the potential abuse, make sure we have mechanisms, whether proactive or reactive, running. But I don't want to scare anybody. But the reality is, there's going to be times the same way that. A vehicle for terrorism nowadays is cars being driven into crowds. It's hard to prevent, and I think it would be unfair to expect a car manufacturer to prevent that from happening.
So I guess I'll add just one last piece, and I want to pick up actually on something that Antigone had said, and sort of where I started, and the thing that I added to the group conversation is that when we talk about the role that companies can play, at least from our perspective, and Antigone mentioned digital citizenship. I think that's, when we talk about solutions, we can't forget that, while we're all sort of on the back end trying to manage the situation, we also want to help sort of the front end, if you will. So I want to highlight, if I can, for 2 seconds, some work that Microsoft did, which we launched, I guess, back in February around Safer Internet Day. We launched this campaign that we're calling the Campaign for Digital Civility. And this is sort of founded on some research we did, and the reason I'm looking down is I want to get my numbers right, where we did research in 14 countries where we asked teens and adults about their exposure to 17 different online risks. And I'd like to share just some of the quick findings here, because I think it's an interesting way to end. But respondents largely found the internet to be a civil place, which is good, yet they're concerned about future risks. 50% of people said that they're concerned about future risks. 65% said that they'd been a victim of at least one online risk. And unfortunately, and this gets into the awareness and education piece, 62% of respondents said they didn't know where to find help with an online risk. So from the data that we collected, we launched what we're calling the Digital Civility Index, which we have for each of the 14 countries, and then sort of one all-up international data point. And it's worth noting that the US, the UK, and Australia showed the lowest incident of risk. And, moving forward, I know 14 countries isn't, the entire world, but we're slowly going to increase that. Next year, I think we're going to do 23 countries and launch that research in February again on Safer Internet Day. And then in addition to that research, and this sort of gets into the digital citizenship piece, we launched what we called the Digital Civility Challenge, and really giving everybody who's working and operating, whatever, playing online, that there are 4 basic ideals that you should commit to. So, live by the golden rule, respect differences, pause before replying, and ultimately stand up for oneself and others. And our hope with this campaign, again, gets to the digital citizenship piece, is that, at the start we talked about the role that companies and others have, and, we all have a role. And I think the point of us doing this research and coming up with these, key themes for people to consider online is that, there are solutions, hopefully, that we can all come up with, and we hope that, by having this conversation, raising awareness, educating, kids, adults, et cetera, how to operate online, because as Antigone said, it's new technology and it's here. People are using it, and I'm biased, obviously, but I think that I personally would be devastated if Facebook went away tomorrow, because I get a lot of my news and friend updates and everything from it. So I sort of think we're all collectively better if we think more broadly than notice and take down or whatnot. So anyway, I'll stop there.
Great. Well, thanks so much. We had a great discussion. I want to thank the audience for being patient as we took a little bit of your time. But thank you so much to all of our great panelists.